Welcome to the Support Raising Solutions podcast, where we help new and current ministry workers grow in being spiritually healthy, vision-driven, and fully funded Great Commission workers. Welcome, everyone, to the SRS podcast. I am your host today, Callie Davis, part of the SRS core team, and I am so excited to be joined by two of my wonderful colleagues from InterVarsity. That is Emery Silva and Alice Adkins. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Glad to be here, Callie.
And Emery, I am still so shocked and amazed. You joined while having COVID. So I deeply, deeply appreciate you making the effort and the time to join us today. Emery Silva has been with InterVarsity for 24 years and is now a part of the national leadership team. She's the Associate Director of MPD, which is Ministry Partner Development. And one of the ways I know I've connected with you is connecting with you about the MPD sprints that you've done and organized. You were able to kind of walk me through how you've done that a while ago. And I did not realize in the past 4 years, you have walked 260 staff members through this kind of short-term, high-effort support raising sprint and raise an average of $12,000 a staff member in 4 weeks. So that's just incredible. You have amazing history of mobilizing staff and being able to cast some vision. So I'm excited for the voice that you bring today.
Thanks, Callie.
Absolutely. And then Alice Adkins, this is the first time I get to meet you. I'm so excited to having heard just a little bit about your history, that you're born in the Philippines to Hong Kong parents, moved to the US. Now you're living in Amsterdam. You've been with InterVarsity for 19 years, and currently you're the Associate National Director of Asian American Ministries. That is a repertoire there. And I'm so glad you joined us today when we're really talking about the cross-cultural aspect of support raising. So I'm so excited to be joined not just with people with kind of the knowledge experience, which is about all I can bring as I've read a lot of books, but to also have personal experience to share with us today. So I'm going to kick it off. Emery, I just would love to have you unpack a little bit that is support raising cross-cultural, or why is it cross-cultural? Why is it worth talking about that aspect of support raising?
Yeah, thanks, Callie. In one of my trainings that I do with staff, just at the very beginning of our sprints, I like to say that MPD is always a cross-cultural experience. When we meet with a donor, we really want to consider all of who they are in terms of gender, ethnicity, culture, geography, age, politics, denomination, socioeconomic status. I mean, we could go on and on and on, right?
Yeah.
So, as we invite partners to join our team, we really want our staff to be donor-centric, orienting their presentation around who the donor is and how the donor communicates. I mean, of course, we always want to stay true to our mission and our calling, but it helps if we pause and think about, who is this person I'm going to meet with? What do they value as we prepare to meet with them? We may find that we're going to move out of our comfort zone at times to meet that donor or that potential donor where they're at, especially if we're going to meet with someone who's different from us ethnically, culturally, or in other ways. But probably as we think about each person we're meeting with, we'll find there's something that's different about them. It's easiest for me to meet with someone who's as similar to me, as possible. Like I have my friend Anna is, we go to the same church. Our kids are the same ages. She lives in my neighborhood. We're both white women. There's so many. We were actually born 2 days apart. I can't think of anybody more similar to me than Anna. So it's easy to meet with Anna, but there's still things that are a little bit different between me and Anna. And then I think about another one of my donors. He's an African man. He grew up in Ghana and came here as an adult. He works as a custodian in my church. So there's a lot of more differences there. And it's beautiful, to see all the differences that we can encounter.
Well, and I love that kind of taking it a step further. I know what I've talked a lot with people about is that support raising is about people, not money. You view people as a person. They are a human being. God created them. God is calling them. They are not an ATM machine. And so I love how you're taking that even a step further of, it's not just a person. Every person is an individual. Have you taken a moment to just pause and think about the implications of that, how you relate to them, how you don't relate to them, because you're about to have a pretty amazing conversation about what God is doing and what God might be doing in their life. And so being aware of kind of the cultural differences could, I think, really help you shape that conversation well, as opposed to just flying blind and assuming everyone will fit your perfect like checklist that you practiced in your training.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when we can be open to who is this person and, you know, what's the scope of who they are, we can have a better connection with them. And then find, as we're looking at what do they value, we can tailor our presentation to that person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think a lot of, listeners are probably doing missions or trying to reach, other people from other cultures. And a lot of times we think about incarnating to the people we're reaching. I think it's the same idea, is that how do we incarnate to our donors and sort of meet where they're at too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in university, when we're training students to go on a cross-cultural missions trip, or even just doing ministry on campus with people who are different from them, we actually teach them skills like, you're probably going to encounter some differences and you might feel uncomfortable, but when you come to that place, can you start with openness rather than judgment? It's easy to go into judgment, like, why are they doing it that way? It's not my way. It doesn't feel right. But if we can stop and say, wait, God made this person too, it's just different, not wrong. We can say, what can I learn? How can I listen rather than going right to judgment or skepticism? How can I learn about who this person is?
And I think it's about shifting perspective too, about like why we approach who we approach and then how we approach them. I know we often start with the safest people to talk to, the people that maybe already know that we're raising support, are already supportive, have already talked about, they love what we do. For whatever reason, they're kind of already in our circle of community, so that we already probably innately know how to approach them and how to communicate with them, even if that process never occurred to us. But when we step outside kind of those concentric circles of how close they are to us, it's important to realize those differences might add up, and it's not a bad thing. Like what you were saying, it's not an us or them. It's not that they're weird, but actually seeing this amazing picture that God can call people to partner with us in ministry that are different from us, that come from different backgrounds, and that we can do the job of crossing that communication awareness so that there's as few barriers as possible for them to hear about what God is doing and to be able to say yes if God is calling them. And that's really beautiful.
Totally. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted Alice to come on this call is that she's helped me so much with coaching staff in their MPD, and Alice has done her own coaching in MPD too. But I think when I started to realize, hey, I'm coaching staff of different ethnicities to reach donors of different ethnicities, and I feel kind of out of my element. I'm not sure how to coach them in a way that fits for them. Alice had developed some really great methods, especially for our Asian American staff, but we've been able to expand some of those methods to other staff in our movement. So I'd love to just have Alice start to talk about indirect communication, because that's one of the key things we teach in the same section when I'm teaching staff how to approach MPD as a cross-cultural experience. We talk about what kind of communicator is your donor, a direct or indirect communicator. So Alice, thanks for joining us to talk about this part.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And it's so great to be here, Callie. I think when we think as a Chinese American who's like sort of in between two cultures, it was really important for me to be able to put words into how I was switching from one or the other. And so indirect and direct communication was super helpful because that communication is a huge part of how cultures work. So as we think about direct communication, I like to think about it as a spectrum and not just a binary. It's like, are you indirect or direct? It's a spectrum, and there's just different indirectness or directness that people go. And so I'm going to give us a couple definitions since we're going there. The direct communication focuses on the words and its exact meanings. It's really straightforward. The speaker's intentions are clear. Like the onus is on the speaker to make themselves clear. The indirect communication has the words, but it also adds the nonverbals, the body language, the gestures, the facial expression, as well as it could be phrasing, inflection, vocabulary choices, and social status, even the context. Are we in the business setting or are we at home? I could say the exact same sentence. It could mean different things because of the context. So even silence could mean something, right? So not saying something could mean something.
Is it just me, or is indirect communication way more complicated?
It is. And some of it is because it's mostly found in traditional cultures, and it's like unsaid rules that's been built over the years. And the reason why we lean toward direct communication in America is because it's a multiple culture kind of thing, like place. And so we sort of had to become more direct to communicate with each other. And so I think one of our biggest tips actually is, if you're going to wade into indirect communication, is to get a cultural informant. Like, it's helpful to find someone who understands both your culture and the indirect culture you're going to, and help you think through sort of like, is this going to work or is this not going to work?
I would say, sorry.
Go ahead.
Alice, too. I think what I've noticed is indirect communication can be like more confusing for those of us who come from a direct culture perspective. But those who grew up in some kind of indirect culture, it's like, it's so intuitive. Like when I've talked to Asian American staff and we finally start naming some of the dynamics, a lot of them seem to say, of course, that's how, like, it's almost like we're starting to speak their native language. And they're like, yes, someone is finally putting it to words. This is why I want to do it this way. And
I love how you talked about the idea of it being a spectrum, not a black and white. And also, this is something that I think really applies to so many people that I've ever talked to about how when you're inviting someone to respond, when you're inviting someone to partner, yes, we talk about making an ask. And I think especially SRS, we talk mostly about a direct ask. And so then when I'm trying to coach someone and say, okay, you don't have to use these exact words. Let's talk about who you're talking to, why that feels uncomfortable or awkward. And I start to kind of explain some layers, and you see these light bulbs go off of, oh, wait, I can still accomplish the fact that I'm inviting someone to partner with me, but it doesn't have to be those 5 words, those 8 words, whatever that one question was. And suddenly it starts to fit better in their context, but it is still an invitation. It isn't just avoiding that piece of a support appointment altogether. So Alice, I just want to hear more. So how do you walk people through not getting too far away from an ask completely, but somehow finding that more subtle, appropriate invitation?
Yeah. And so there are a lot of ways to do that. I think what you were saying, like, starts getting there. A lot of times I think about, like, what is the intention of a direct ask, right? Like you said, let's not throw it all out just because cultural difference, right? Oh,
right.
It's not how I do it. But you have to do the hard work of thinking through, okay, why is it being done that way? What was the intent? How does doing that, like what you said, break certain cultural rules? And then what is something that is culturally appropriate that you can replace it with?
Do you have an example of that?
Yeah. So let me, like, in sort of the way I've thought about my, parents' generation in Chinese immigrant culture, doing an MPD ask. In a direct ask, you would ask a potential ministry partner, would you give $150 a month? Right. And so Chinese cultural values, putting someone in a position where they have to say, they might say no to you, is seen as not appropriate, is seen as dishonoring. And we can go a little later into honor shame culture. If we want to go down that rabbit hole. It feels like, so in some ways, like, if I even do a direct ask that direct, I would never put money in there. I might even put like a program, like, oh, these are the different ranges that people choose to do. Right. And so that's sort of like a little less direct.
Okay.
you know. And then I always try to give them a few options, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we generally teach this, like you want them to become your partner. So you ask for prayer, you ask if they want to volunteer, if you want to ask, if you would give financially. Now, when you're doing a direct ask, sometimes you can forget like the other two parts and it'd be okay, right? And you can still call them up later and be like, hey, Steve, what did you decide? How did you partner? But I always include all three because then they might say, if you call them up and they're like, oh, I think we're just going to pray for you. That's what God is calling us to. That is actually a no, right? But you didn't force them to say no, but you set up the situation so that it was natural and not losing face and not, dishonoring in a shame, honor shame culture that they had to say no to you face to face, And so there's more examples that we could go to in a different way of, if you don't want to, in order to make sure people don't have to say no to you face to face, sometimes you might email, right? So email is a little more appropriate than them saying to know you to face to face.
Sure.
Other situations, I don't know how people feel about this, is like in Chinese culture, the advocate ask is actually fairly huge because they can say no to the advocate because they're not losing face. They're not saying, oh, I don't really have the money to help you out. Sorry, friend, but they can say no to your advocate. And then interestingly enough, if you do group asks, you're allowed to be a little more direct because it's a general sort of, you're giving it to the whole group. So you're not putting one person into that situation of having to say no to you. Now you have to think creatively about your follow-up, as to like, how direct are you going to do your follow-up? Or how indirect are you going to do your follow-up in order to help them, so that's just an example of one Chinese, cultural value that I'm trying to uphold, but I'm not throwing out the baby out with the bathwater, right? But I'm trying to think about ways to really uphold that value.
Hey, Alice. Sorry, Alice. I wonder if you could fill in a little bit more about what honor shame culture is, because I'm not sure everybody who's listening would understand it. Some people might, but some people might not. And that's really helped. When you've taught me about honor shame culture, it really helped me to better come alongside donors and, staff in that way. Yeah.
And so if people want to Google it, there's like web pages. It's like a huge topic. So I'll just touch on a little bit. In honor shame culture, people communicate in a way that seeks to bring honor and avoid shaming the person, right? Sometimes it's called saving face. So it's almost like you, as a bicultural person who has, been grown up American and Chinese, sometimes I feel frustrated by indirect ask or honor shame because it feels like it's inefficient. Why can't we just get it done? So as I've grown older, this is how I like to try to think about it, right? Is that at its best, honor shame culture seeks to take loving your neighbor to the next level. They want to take loving your neighbor so seriously that they will take away any possibility of awkwardness, right? I want to love you so much. I'm going to make sure I think through all possibilities where I might put you into an uncomfortable position, right? So I'm going to think through all of it and I'm not going to do any of it, right? So,
oh boy.
Yeah. So at its best, I feel like, that's the intent. That's the heart behind honor shame is like, I want to give you so much honor that I won't put you in a situation that's awkward. Now, each culture has different definition of what that awkward situation is, right? Like Chinese culture would be different from, Indian culture, from like Korean, and yeah. And here in the US, Native versus Latino, like all sorts.
I'm curious because one of the things that I've kind of come up against as I've been coaching staff is as I'm trying to help them navigate their community, who they're reaching out to, it often feels easier to be more indirect than necessary. Is that something you also deal with? And how do you help people kind of find the best path forward, not the easiest or the easiest to train, which the direct ask can be very easy to teach someone?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. That's such a great question. I mean, one thing, what Emery said about being donor centric, we always keep saying that, right? Because it could be easy for me as an Asian American to keep just sending letters and never follow up and then hide behind like, I'm doing indirect asks. Right. But if I have it on my sheet and I'm thinking donor centric, right? Then I'm like, oh, it's a student that I staffed who's white from the Midwest. I need to like muster up sort of the courage to be like, will you support me $150 a month? Right? So donor centric is super helpful to us. A practical tip is I usually put a column for my whoever is coaching me or supervisor to say what kind of indirect ask I'm going to do. So we actually put together a gradient of how indirect to direct. Like most indirect is I'm just sending them my newsletter. And that's like people in my church that I don't even know in my parents' generation that, you know, and then so we actually like Emery and I have been working on this gradient of like, how do you tell how indirect the person is? And then what kind of ask should you do? Is it going to be a group ask? What am I going to do about follow-up? So I actually have it listed like 1 to 5, all the different kinds, right? And I will write that down for my supervisor. Because what's scary to supervisors is that they don't know if you're going to do a direct or indirect ask. Actually, a funny story. When I became a supervisor, I panicked. Oh, no. Because I was in the Midwest. All my supervisees were, you know, white Midwestern folk. And at our sort of MPD meetings that we have every month, we will ask in the end, how many asks did you do? Right. And when I became a supervisor, I went to an Asian American sort of like higher up than me and older than me. And I was like, Greg, I don't do any asks. How do I answer that? And he's like, well, have you been funded these last 8 years? I'm like, yes. He's like, you do indirect asks. And then I was like, bing, you know, like, oh, I do indirect asks. It's not that I just don't do anything. I do a lot of hard work of being direct with advocates to tell them, can you advocate for me this way? But it's just not the same category. So that actually was very much like a moment of like, oh, this is what the difference. And I actually need to put this extra column in my reports up to my supervisor so that they know where it keeps me accountable. Sure. Because then if I put all in like the super most indirect, it looks a little sketchy, right? and then they can also say, hey, this person doesn't look Asian. Why would you say, you know? So, and then when I'm training Asian American staff, I usually challenge them, you know, there is a lot of fear in fundraising and it's easy for us to hide, but I want you to take it one little level up so that you're uncomfortable. So I'm not saying you need to do will you support me $150 a month if that's not appropriate, but will you do it one level up from comfort, right? So because we had sort of listed all the different asks, and I think Emery might explain more of that in the next podcast. Right?
Yes, I'm super excited. You guys have agreed to come back and do another podcast, which will probably release a couple weeks after this. So if any of what we've been discussing here today is helpful, do tune in the future as well.
Yeah. And so I asked them, like, can you make it uncomfortable for you? If you're comfortable with it, then it feels a little like, maybe we're taking the easy way out. So those are two things I've sort of tried to practically put in place. And, you know, you can even ask your supervisor or your coach, or as a coach, you can ask them, okay, are these, you know, I hear you're doing it this way. Is this feel super comfortable? What is the Lord asking you to take a little step forward towards risk, right? How would we make this a little riskier? Not to say you have to do it completely directly,
Sure.
One other thing I'll add to that is when I'm getting to know staff, and about to coach them in an MPD sprint, I will ask them to identify where they are on the spectrum of indirectness, whether they're Asian American or not. It's very educational for me, because if I find out that, hey, this person prefers to be, this level of indirect, we have this gradient that we can't show you because it's a podcast, but, if they put themselves in the middle of that gradient, telling me that they're medium indirect, that's really helpful information for me as a coach, because then I know I have to coach them to a certain level, especially if they're reaching out to direct communicators. I had this one team of white staff, they're in the South, and the South tends to be a little more indirect. But I found out that these women would never ask for a dollar amount. And so I was like, ladies, we got to overcome this. That's not the right approach for this culture. And so I started coaching them very specifically, and actually like finding ways to reward them. If they would ask for $100 a month or whatever, like I would give them a reward, because we needed to change that habit. That habit wasn't born out of what was best for the donor. It was born out of comfort for the fundraiser. And so once we were able to overcome that, and then they start to see, hey, good things happen when I take this scary step that my coach wants me to take, it starts to change, the narrative in their head. So it is like an art and a science, I would say.
Yeah.
It's complex, but it's rewarding.
Well, and I think probably the biggest takeaways I'm hearing from both of you ladies is the need to not do this process alone. Especially if you are maybe a little more culturally unaware, either of yourself or the partners you're reaching out to. I loved, Alice, what you mentioned, having that cultural coach, or what did you call it?
Informant.
Yes.
Yeah.
To help you navigate that, because I think growing in I've heard it called a culture quotient, kind of like an IQ. But that can take time, some work. You don't just naturally have that per se. So getting some help would be really helpful. And I also loved where you talked about having a coach, having that sounding board that can help push you to be a little uncomfortable and kind of staying in that space of, yes, I am pushing myself to try something a little more out there, a little more direct, or a little more not just what my natural default inclination is, so that I actually am being oriented to the people I'm reaching the most effectively. And so having a person be able to say, okay, wait, you're going way, way too far, come back. Which I love the few times I've had to do that as a coach. Often it's like, okay, we can be a little more bold, a little more gospel on fire here. Having someone else discern that with you is so helpful.
Totally. And I think that also is an invitation to those of us who do MPD coaching to really tune into who is my coachee and who is the community, or what is the nature of the community they're reaching out to. I mean, when I became an MPD coach, most of the people I coached were reaching out to people in communities that I was not familiar with. Like I didn't know much about, my coachee's, Black inner city community, in one hand. And then I had another coachee who was very artistic, and she was also in the city, and she was also Black. And like, that was a little bit of a different community to learn about. And, then I had this one guy who, a Chinese American man in his 20s, and he raised all of his support very quickly, but he refused to pick up the phone. Like he did it all by texting. And so in each of these circumstances, there was an invitation for me as a coach to really figure out who is my coachee and how do I best coach them into this situation that, it's not all cookie cutter. Because if I don't understand those communities, then I'm not going to be as helpful as a coach. One other story I'll tell about that is my second year of being an MPD coach, I coached a woman who was raised in Hong Kong. She was an international student. And so she did 4 years of college in the US and came on staff with InterVarsity. And she did a bunch of asks in the US that were very direct asks, but then she went back to Hong Kong to make the majority of her asks. And it was a little bit challenging for me to figure out how to coach her, but I had to really trust her instincts. And she was one of those staff that you really feel like you can trust. Like she's, very solid and very much, very earnest, wanting to raise her support. So she worked with her pastor in Hong Kong, and it's, Hong Kong, it's a very indirect community. And we're not even talking about Asian American. We're talking about like literally in Asia. So I had to trust her instincts. And what she and her pastor decided to do is her pastor advocated for her to go to various small groups in the church. So she went to small group after small group after small group. She presented about what she was going to do with InterVarsity's ministry. She invited them to consider being a part of it, but she didn't mention dollar amounts necessarily. Then she came back to the US after being there for about a month, and she did all of the follow-up by email, one-on-one follow-ups. And I'm sure her pastor kind of went back and advocated for her again, that people would support her. And she was like fully funded by the fall. The support came in, but it was a different way, than the way that she was raising support in the US. And, me being able to listen to her and trust her instincts, in this situation was really what she needed.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that about Emery, is that she has done a lot of that work to try to figure out communities. Because I think as a woman of color, sometimes it's hard to put into words your instincts, right? Yeah. So it's helpful to have someone who's actually like paying attention to it, or already have other experience that can be like, oh yeah, what you want to do is an advocate ask, instead of like, I don't know, I just have this. And you know what? The hard part is like, when we're bicultural, sometimes we have more instincts in one way than the other. So I've talked to colleagues and they were like, yeah, I usually don't do X, but I do Y. And I was like, oh, you're allowed to do that? I just awkwardly break the culture and like, and be all business-like when you're not supposed to be business-like, So some people, I think it also benefits those who don't intuitively figure out the rules, or maybe grew up in a more dominant, like community. And so doing the work is helpful in that. And also Emery and I were like, we can't show you all our models and graphs and charts. So we actually put together a little survey if anyone is interested in more information or we're thinking, maybe we'll do a training. We'll give it to Callie and it'll get dropped somewhere, hopefully in the show notes.
I will figure out how to put it in the show notes, which I don't know how to do at this moment, but we definitely want to give out as many resources as possible. SRS, we don't have all the answers, but we love to be a place of connection of other organizations, other people, other leaders, helping other people so that the gospel moves forward. So thank you so much for being willing to share some of what you guys have developed and spent so much time and effort into. We all benefit greatly.
Thanks so much, Callie, for inviting us to come. And I love how SRS is so open and so, eager to hear from different voices. We've always appreciated partnering with SRS over the years.
Well, thank you so much. It has been delightful, and I'm excited to continue this conversation a little bit further. So just a reminder, we plan to have another episode with Emery and Alice, continuing this concept of indirect asks and talking a little bit further. So I hope you guys come back for that episode. Other than that, thank you, listeners, for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful day, and we pray for you guys to be spiritually healthy, vision-driven, and fully funded. And we hope that this episode has been encouraging and helpful in that. So have a lovely day. Goodbye. Thanks for joining us today, and please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode as we work to give more insight into building and maintaining your ministry partnership team.